The first time my own boy said, "You owe me," I was standing at my kitchen sink with dishwater up to my wrists, watching the last light of day melt into the backyard. His voice came through the phone like a cold draft under a door. I dried my hands on a towel that had been washed too many times, and I still remember how my fingers shook when I pressed it to my mouth so he wouldn't hear me breathe. For a second, I just stood there, dripping soap onto the linoleum, because the sentence didn't belong to my boy. It belonged to bill collectors and men in suits, to strangers who think they can measure a life in numbers. The kitchen smelled like lemon detergent and yesterday's onions, and all I could see was the groove in the counter where Frank used to tap his wedding ring when he was thinking. I remember staring at that worn little mark and thinking how grief teaches you to live with empty space, how you set a place at the table for someone who isn't coming back, how you stop reaching for a second mug in the morning. But betrayal is different. Betrayal doesn't make a hole. It builds a wall, brick by quiet brick, until you realize you're on the outside of your own family. I wanted to tell David he was wrong, that love isn't a tab you keep open until it's paid, that motherhood is a vow, not a contract. Instead, I swallowed the words the way I'd swallowed so many things over the years. My pride when the car wouldn't start, my fear when the doctor used big words, my frustration when David came home with that look that meant trouble and I still smoothed his hair anyway. Outside the window, the last light slipped behind the fence and turned the glass into a dark mirror. And there I was, an older woman with dishwater on her sleeves, eyes red, mouth pressed tight, looking like someone who'd been waiting her whole life to be told she didn't own what she'd earned. The phone stayed against my ear, heavy as a stone, and I realized with a kind of sick clarity that David had practiced this. You don't say, "You owe me," for the first time without rehearsing it in your head, turning it over like a key you're about to use. And when he finally said it out loud, he didn't sound angry. He sounded certain. I'm 68 now, and I've learned that betrayal doesn't always arrive with shouting. Sometimes it comes politely, in a calm tone, wrapped in family words. It comes with a sigh and a pause, like the person on the other end is doing you a favor by taking what you have. My name is Margaret, and for most of my life I have been the kind of woman people call steady. I paid my bills early, saved grocery receipts in a shoebox, clipped coupons, and never let the mailbox overflow. I raised my son, David, through years that didn't give us much room to breathe. His father, Frank, was a railroad man with big hands and a soft laugh. When Frank died, just like that, a heart attack in the break room with a styrofoam cup of coffee beside him, my world became quiet in a way that felt wrong. The house didn't stop needing heat. The taxes didn't stop coming. The electric company didn't care that I was learning how to sleep alone. I worked the front desk at a small dental office through my 50s, smiling at people who complained about co-pays while I counted quarters for laundry. I packed David's lunches in brown bags and kissed his forehead even when he pulled away, like boys do when they're trying to be men. And I was proud of him. I still am, in some stubborn corner of my heart. David grew into a man who knew how to talk. He had that smooth kind of confidence, the kind that gets you hired and forgiven. He married young, divorced faster, and came back into my life in waves. Phone calls when he needed something, silence when he didn't. When my hair started going gray and my knees began to ache in the mornings, he started showing up a little more often. At first, it looked like love. He'd stop by with a bag of oranges, like that was his way of taking care of me. He'd fix a loose cabinet hinge, then sit at my table and scroll on his phone while I made coffee. He'd say things like, "Ma, you shouldn't be alone so much," and I'd feel my chest warm with gratitude, even if the words came with a restless edge, like he was already halfway out the door. One Saturday in early fall, he showed up with paperwork. It was a bright morning, and the neighborhood smelled like cut grass and someone's bacon. I had my sweater on, even though it wasn't cold yet, because old bones don't always follow the weather. I was sorting mail at the table: water bill, pharmacy receipt, the bank statement I always opened, with the careful dread of someone who had once lived paycheck to paycheck. David sat down across from me and pushed a folder forward, the kind with a tab and neat labels. He smiled like he was bringing me a gift. "I've been thinking," he said. "We should get your affairs in order." I glanced at the folder and felt my stomach tighten. That phrase, "affairs in order," is something people say right before they take control. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. He leaned back and crossed his arms. "It's just responsible. If something happens, we don't want a mess." I didn't like the way he said "we," as if my life was already a shared asset. Still, I opened the folder. There were forms inside: a durable power of attorney, a living will, some financial authorization document, with a space for my signature at the bottom, and David's name typed neatly in the section labeled agent. My coffee went cold while I read. "David," I said carefully, "why do you need access to my accounts?" He let out a patient laugh, the kind you use on a child who doesn't understand. "Ma, it's not like I'm going to steal from you." That word landed like a slap because it was his choice to bring it into the room. "I didn't say that," I murmured. "But you're thinking it." His eyes flicked toward the bank statement I had left on the table. "Look, you have savings. You've got a little nest egg. And you know I've been struggling." There it was, the pivot, the moment the oranges and cabinet hinges turned into leverage. He told me his rent had gone up. His car needed repairs. His job was in transition, which I learned over time was a fancy way of saying he'd left another position on bad terms. He spoke quickly, like he was trying to outrun my questions. "I'm not asking for a handout," he said, holding up his palms. "I'm asking for what's fair." "What's fair?" I repeated, tasting the words like something bitter. He leaned forward, lowering his voice as if we were discussing something confidential, something between allies. "Ma, I gave up years for you. I took care of you. I was there. I didn't have to be." I stared at him. I saw my baby's face for a split second. The boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during Sunday movies. Then it was gone, replaced by a man who counted love like a debt. "I raised you," I said quietly, my throat tight. "That's what parents do." "And I stayed," he shot back. "I didn't run off like Dad did." Frank had not run off. Frank had died. David knew that, and yet he used it like a knife, twisting old grief into a point he could aim at me. My hands were flat on the table now, fingertips pressing into the wood. I felt the room tilt, not physically, but emotionally, like I was standing on a floor that wasn't as solid as I'd believed. David's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then back at me, irritation flickering. "I'm not trying to fight. I'm just telling you how it is. You owe me for raising you." For a heartbeat, I didn't understand. The sentence didn't make sense, like a typo in a contract. "I owe you," I said slowly. He nodded, as if this was obvious. "Yeah, you had me. You needed me. You leaned on me. I missed out on things because of you." I felt heat rise behind my eyes, not the dramatic kind of crying, just that sting that comes when you realize someone has been rewriting your history. I had been a widow, a working mother, a woman who skipped meals so her child could have seconds. And here he sat, claiming the childhood I gave him was a burden he carried for my sake. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I'd learned long ago that anger can be used against you, made to look like instability. So I did what steady women do. I swallowed. I slid the folder back toward him with 2 fingers, like it was something dirty. I'm not signing anything today. His jaw tightened. Why are you being difficult? I'm not being difficult, I said, keeping my voice even. I'm being careful. He scoffed and stood up, pushing his chair back hard enough that it scraped. The sound made my heart jump. Fine, be careful, but don't come crying to me when you need help. He walked to the door with the confidence of someone who believed he'd already won, then paused with his hand on the knob. You know, he added, not looking at me, if you loved me, you'd want me to have a better life. Then he was gone, and the house felt too quiet again. I sat there a long time with the paperwork still open on my table, the bank statement beside it like a target. Outside, a lawnmower droned in the distance. A dog barked. Life went on, indifferent. I went to the sink and washed the coffee mug, even though it wasn't dirty. My hands needed something to do. That night, I pulled out the shoebox I kept in the hall closet, the one with years of receipts, canceled checks, warranty cards, and handwritten notes. Frank used to tease me about it. Maggie, he'd say, you keep records like the IRS is your pen pal. Maybe he was right. Maybe that habit was the only reason I was about to survive what came next. Because I knew something then, sitting on my bed in the dim light of the lamp, listening to the refrigerator hum through the wall. David wasn't asking for help. He was preparing to take. And if I didn't learn how to protect myself, legally, calmly, completely, I would wake up one day with an empty account, a signed document I barely understood, and a son who called it fair. I didn't sleep much after that night. The house creaked the way it always had, but every sound felt louder, like it was reminding me that I was alone with my thoughts. By morning, I had dark half-moons under my eyes and a headache that settled in behind my temples. I made oatmeal, ate half of it, then wrapped the rest and put it in the fridge out of habit. Waste always made me uneasy. David didn't call. That silence was almost worse than his words. Over the next week, I moved through my days like I was underwater. At the grocery store, I caught myself rereading prices I'd known by heart for years. At the pharmacy, I held onto the counter a little longer than necessary, steadying myself while the clerk printed my receipt. Everything felt fragile, including me. Then the mail started changing. One afternoon, I opened an envelope from my bank that I didn't recognize. Inside was a glossy flyer about account consolidation options and a note that said someone had inquired about adding an authorized user. No changes had been made, it said. Not yet. My heart thudded hard enough that I had to sit down. I called the customer service number printed at the bottom. After the usual maze of recorded voices, a young man came on the line. His voice was polite, distant. I just want to make sure no one has access to my accounts, I told him. He confirmed my balance, my recent transactions, my address. Then he paused. There was a call earlier this week, he said. Someone identifying themselves as your son asked general questions. I closed my eyes. Did you give him any information? No, ma'am, he replied, but I'd recommend adding a verbal password to your profile. After I hung up, I sat at the table and stared at the wall. David hadn't needed my signature yet. He was circling, testing doors. That evening, he showed up again. He didn't knock. He still had a key from years ago, and the sound of it turning in the lock made my chest tighten. He walked in like nothing had happened, like we were still playing house. You okay? He asked, glancing around. You look tired. I am, I said. He sat down and sighed dramatically. I've been doing some thinking. So had I. I shouldn't have come at you like that, he continued. But you have to see it from my side. I've been helping you for years. I thought of the oranges, the hinge, the long gaps between phone calls. I appreciate help, I said slowly. But help isn't the same as obligation. He frowned. You're twisting my words. I'm repeating them, I replied. His jaw tightened again. Look, Ma, I talked to a friend. He said this is normal. Parents help their kids. You don't need all that money just sitting there. I stood up then, needing the height, the space. That money is how I pay my bills. It's how I stay in this house. You could move, he said, shrugging. Downsize, live simpler. I stared at him. He was offering to shrink my life so his could feel bigger. I'm not signing anything, I said. He laughed, sharp and humorless. You don't trust me. I trust myself, I answered. That was when his tone changed. Be careful, he said quietly. You're not as independent as you think. The threat sat between us, unspoken but heavy. Age can be used like a weapon, and he knew it. After he left, I locked the door and slid the deadbolt into place. My hands shook, but my mind was oddly clear. The next morning, I made an appointment with a lawyer. Her office was small, tucked between a tax service and a nail salon. She was about my age, with reading glasses on a chain and a voice that didn't rush. I told her everything, about Frank, about David, about the paperwork, the phone call to the bank, the way my son spoke as if my life were a ledger. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she nodded. You're not alone, she said, and you're not powerless. She explained things carefully, the difference between helping and surrendering control, the risks of signing documents you don't fully understand, the importance of clear boundaries, written and enforced. I walked out of that office lighter than I'd felt in weeks, a folder of my own this time tucked under my arm. That afternoon, I went to the bank in person. I added passwords, removed old permissions I'd forgotten existed, and updated my contact preferences. The teller smiled and called me sweetheart. And for once, I didn't mind. I was doing something sweet for myself. When I got home, I placed my shoebox on the table and opened it again. Receipts, statements, notes in Frank's handwriting, proof of a life carefully lived. David thought my steadiness meant weakness. He thought my silence meant consent. He was wrong. I wasn't finished being kind, but I was done being careless. The breaking point came quietly, the way most truths do. It wasn't a fight or a slammed door, it was a voicemail. I was folding laundry on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of ordinary moment you forget as soon as it passes. Socks paired, towels stacked, the hum of the dryer filling the room. My phone buzzed on the table, and I let it go to voicemail because my hands were full and my heart was tired. When I listened later, I had to sit down. Ma, David's voice said, slow and deliberate. I talked to someone who knows these things. If you don't start cooperating, people might get the wrong idea about your ability to manage on your own. I don't want things to get complicated. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten me outright. He didn't have to. I replayed the message 3 times, each listen sinking deeper into my bones. He was planting a seed, a dangerous one. The idea that I was confused, that I needed supervision, that my independence was negotiable. Have you ever realized too late that someone was quietly rewriting who you were? That night, I barely touched my dinner. The fork rested in my hand while memories crowded in. Frank teaching David how to ride a bike in the driveway. David at 10, sick with the flu, curled against me on the couch. Me at 42 standing in line at the bank, opening my first savings account after Frank died, promising myself I would never be at anyone's mercy again. And here I was, decades later, feeling that promise slip. The next few weeks blurred together. David began calling more often, always during business hours, always asking pointed questions. Did you pay that bill yet? Did you move any money? Who are you talking to these days? Once, he mentioned a neighbor by name, someone I'd chatted with exactly twice. That's when I realized he was watching, not just listening. I started writing things down, dates, times, exact words, not because I planned to use them, but because I needed to trust my own memory. Gaslighting only works when there's fog. I was clearing mine. One afternoon, I found an envelope taped crookedly to my front door. Inside was a brochure for an assisted living facility across town. No note, no explanation. My hands went cold. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the smiling gray-haired couples on the glossy pages, and something inside me hardened. Not into anger, into resolve. I made another appointment with my lawyer. This time, I didn't cry. I laid out the voicemail, my notes, the brochure. She listened, her expression tightening in small, professional ways. "This matters," she said. "Intent matters." She explained how accusations of incapacity can be weaponized, how important it was that my choices were documented, proactive, and unmistakably mine. She suggested evaluations, safeguards, witnesses, not because I was weak, but because I was being challenged. I agreed to everything. The cognitive assessment felt strange at first. Sitting across from a calm woman with a clipboard, answering questions about dates, names, simple math, I passed easily. The results were typed, signed, official. Proof of what I already knew. I also installed a small security camera at my front door. Nothing fancy, just enough to record who came and went. The technician explained it patiently, handed me a receipt, and wished me a nice day. Another piece of paper, another anchor. David didn't know any of this yet. He came by one evening with takeout, acting almost cheerful. He talked about a fresh start, about how we could simplify things if I'd just trust him. He spoke as if I were tired, as if the world were too much for me. I watched him closely then, not as a mother, but as a woman learning someone new. When he left, I checked the camera footage. He lingered on the porch longer than necessary, making a phone call, pacing. I saved the clip. That night, lying in bed, I asked myself a question that hurt more than any threat. Have you ever loved someone so much that you ignored the moment they stopped loving you back the same way? I didn't sleep much, but when morning came, I felt steadier than I had in months. I had documents now. Records, professional voices that weren't mine saying the truth out loud. David believed I was fragile because I was quiet. He didn't understand that quiet can be preparation. And I was done preparing to lose. The strange thing was how normal everything still looked from the outside. The sun came up. The trash truck rattled down the street on Thursdays. I paid my utilities online and printed the confirmation pages, slipping them into my folder the way I always had. If someone had peeked through my windows, they would have seen an old woman watering her plants, humming softly, moving through her routines like nothing was wrong. Inside, I was changing. David began stopping by without warning, not often enough to call it care, but just enough to remind me he was nearby. Each visit followed the same pattern. He'd comment on my house, my clothes, my memory. Small things, said casually, like seeds tossed onto soil he hoped was already soft. "You still driving at night?" he asked once, glancing at my car keys on the counter. "That can be dangerous at your age." Another time he frowned at my checkbook. "You sure you're balancing that right?" I answered calmly. I smiled. I offered coffee, and after he left, I wrote everything down. There's a particular loneliness that comes when the person hurting you is the one who knows your history best. David knew which buttons to press because he'd watched me install them. He knew my fears about becoming a burden, about losing my home, about being seen as helpless. He wrapped those fears around his arguments and presented them as concern. One afternoon, He brought someone with him. "This is Carol," he said, standing aside to let a woman in her 40s step forward. She wore sensible shoes and a polite smile. "She helps families plan for the future." Carol shook my hand, her grip firm but impersonal. She glanced around my living room the way people do when they're already calculating value. "We just want to talk," David said. "No pressure." But pressure filled the room anyway. Carol spoke in smooth phrases about options and transitions, about how many seniors feel relief when responsibilities are shared. She mentioned paperwork, evaluations, structured support. Every sentence seemed designed to make surrender sound like comfort. I listened. I nodded. I asked questions that made her pause. "What exactly would my son control?" I asked. She smiled again. "Well, finances to start, just to make sure things are handled efficiently." "And if I disagree with the decision?" David answered that one. "Ma, we wouldn't disagree." I felt something settle deep in my chest then. Not sadness, clarity. "I'll think about it," I said. Carol looked relieved. David looked triumphant. After they left, I replayed the door camera footage. Carol arrived in David's car. They left together, talking animatedly. I saved that clip too. The next step I took wasn't dramatic. It was practical. I scheduled a meeting with my bank manager, a woman named Denise, who had been there long enough to recognize me by name. I brought my documents, the assessment, my notes. I explained the situation calmly, without emotion. Denise listened carefully. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she nodded and said, "You're doing the right thing coming in early." We set up additional safeguards, alerts for any inquiry, a requirement that all changes be done in person with identification, a note placed on my account that any claims of incapacity were to be referred directly to my attorney. Each step felt like adding another lock to a door I hadn't realized was so exposed. David called that evening. "I stopped by earlier," he said. "You weren't home." "I had errands," I replied. There was a pause. "You should tell me when you go out." "I don't need permission," I said gently. His breath sharpened on the other end. "You're being paranoid." "No," I answered. "I'm being responsible." He hung up without saying goodbye. A few days later, I received a certified letter. It was from a legal office, politely worded, suggesting that it might be time to discuss guardianship options in light of recent concerns. No accusations, no proof, just implication. My hands trembled as I held the paper. Not from fear this time, but from disbelief. He had actually done it. He had taken the idea he'd planted and tried to make it real. I called my lawyer immediately. She was calm, reassuring. "This is exactly why we prepared," she said. "You haven't done anything wrong, and you're not unprotected." We drafted a response, clear, firm, backed by documentation. It stated my competence, my wishes, and my refusal to entertain further attempts to undermine my autonomy. It requested that all communication go through legal channels. When the letter was sent, I felt something lift from my shoulders. David didn't come by for a while after that. The silence stretched. It hurt, but it also gave me space to breathe. I started walking in the mornings again, greeting neighbors I'd known for years but never really talked to. I joined a small book club at the library, surprised by how much I enjoyed listening more than speaking. I was building a life that didn't orbit around him. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sky turn pink and gray, I realized something quietly important. I wasn't fighting my son anymore. I was standing up for myself. And no matter how this ended, that part of me wasn't going back to sleep. I used to believe that love meant endurance, that if you stayed long enough, if you absorbed enough discomfort quietly, the other person would eventually soften. Somewhere along the way, I learned that endurance can be mistaken for permission. David resurfaced in my life slowly, the way a bruise changes color before it fades. A text message first. Short. Careful. Just checking on you. Then a voicemail a week later, lighter in tone, as if nothing heavy had ever passed between us. He didn't mention the letter. He didn't mention the lawyer. He spoke about the weather, about traffic, about how busy he was. I listened without responding. The next time he came by, he brought groceries. Not oranges this time, but expensive things. Cheese I'd never buy, prepared meals with labels promising convenience. He set them on my counter and looked around, noticing small changes I hadn't pointed out. The new lamp by my chair. The folder no longer sitting in plain sight. "You look good," he said. "Healthier." "Thank you," I replied. We sat across from each other at the table, like strangers who shared a long history, but didn't know how to speak it anymore. He avoided my eyes when the silence stretched. "I just want things to be normal again," he said finally. I folded my hands. "Normal for who?" He sighed, frustrated. "Why are you doing this? Bringing lawyers into family matters?" "I didn't bring them in," I said softly. "You did." His mouth opened, then closed. He leaned back and studied me, really studied me, as if trying to locate the weak spot he'd always relied on. I didn't give it to him. "You've changed," he said. "Yes," I agreed. That answer seemed to unsettle him more than any argument. A few days later, I received a call from Adult Protective Services. The woman on the line introduced herself calmly, professionally. She explained that a concern had been raised about my well-being and that they were required to follow up. I thanked her. We scheduled a visit for the following week. I wrote the date and time neatly in my calendar, then called my lawyer to inform her. Nothing about the situation felt frightening anymore. It felt procedural. The day of the visit, I baked a small batch of oatmeal cookies. Not as a performance, but because baking steadied my hands. The social worker arrived on time, carrying a clipboard and wearing a neutral expression. She asked questions. I answered them. I showed her my documents, my bills, my organized files. I spoke plainly about my relationship with my son, about recent events, about my wishes. She listened carefully, asked a few clarifying questions, and nodded. "I see no cause for concern," she said at last. "You're clearly capable and informed." After she left, I sat down and let myself breathe fully for the first time in days. David called that evening. "They came to your house," he said. His voice was tight. "Yes," I replied. "And?" he pressed. "And everything was fine." Silence stretched between us. When he spoke again, the confidence I'd known all my life was gone. "I was just trying to help." "I know," I said. And I did. I knew what he told himself, but intent doesn't erase impact. "I need you to hear me," I continued. "I love you, but my money, my home, my decisions are not yours. They never were." He didn't argue. He didn't apologize either. He simply said he needed time. After that, the calls stopped. In the quiet that followed, I discovered new rhythms. Morning walks became longer, conversations with neighbors deeper. I learned the names of the librarians, the barista at the small cafe on Main Street. I began volunteering 2 afternoons a week, sorting donations and listening to stories that reminded me I wasn't alone in reinvention. One afternoon, while filing papers, I came across an old photograph. Frank and David, years ago, standing by the tracks, both smiling into the sun. I held it for a long time. Love doesn't disappear when boundaries appear. It just changes shape. I placed the photo back in the drawer, closed it gently, and locked it. Not to hide it away, but to keep it safe. For the first time in a long while, the quiet in my house felt earned. The first snow of the season came early, dusting my porch steps like powdered sugar. I stood at the window with a mug of tea warming my hands, watching the neighborhood turn quiet and pale. For a moment, everything looked peaceful enough to fool me into thinking the storm had passed. Then my phone lit up with a notification from my bank. It was a simple alert, the kind I had asked for when Denise helped me lock things down. Inquiry attempted. No money moved, no changes made, just someone knocking on a door they weren't allowed to open. My throat went tight anyway. I called the bank right away, and Denise picked up on the second ring. "Margaret," she said gently, "I was about to call you. Someone came in this morning asking about your accounts." I didn't have to ask who. "He had your name," Denise continued, "but he didn't have the password, and he didn't have the authority. We refused. He argued. He said you'd been confused lately." My fingers curled around the phone so hard I could feel my knuckles ache. "Did he make a scene?" "Not loud," she said, and I could hear the caution in her voice, the way professionals choose words. "But he pushed. He wanted someone higher up. He asked if we had a policy for elderly customers who need oversight." I stared at the snow collecting on the railing, the world outside so clean, while my insides felt bruised. "Thank you," I said, "for protecting me." "That's what we're here for," Denise replied. "And Margaret, we documented everything, date, time, aussi," what he said. When I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and stared at my hands. They were older now, with thin skin and little brown spots, but they were still my hands. They had paid every bill that kept this house standing. They had held my son when he was small. They had signed papers I understood, not papers placed in front of me like traps. Have you ever felt your own child trying to pull your life out of your hands, little by little, and call it love? I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I put on my coat and drove to my lawyer's office through slow, careful traffic. The roads were slick, and the radio kept warning about black ice, but I felt steady. Fear had turned into something more useful. My lawyer read the bank's incident note Denise had emailed over, then looked up at me with that calm, level gaze. "He's escalating," she said, "but he's also getting careless." Careless was a strange comfort. Careless people leave footprints. She told me we had options, not dramatic ones, not cruel ones, just firm measures that create distance and consequences. She spoke about harassment, about boundaries that become enforceable when they're written clearly and served properly. She reminded me that I didn't have to wait until something worse happened to prove I deserved peace. When I left her office, I didn't feel like a woman plotting revenge. I felt like a woman finally choosing herself without apology. That afternoon, I went home and printed the voicemail transcript I'd typed out months ago. I pulled up the camera clip of David pacing on my porch, phone to his ear, and saved it to a folder with the date in the file name. I laid out the certified letter he'd sent through that legal office. I added the bank's documentation and the APS visit summary. Paper after paper, proof after proof, not of my weakness, but of his pattern. The next morning, my lawyer arranged a meeting at the local police station, not to have David arrested, not to create a spectacle, but to establish a record. The station smelled like old coffee and wet wool. A television in the corner played a morning talk show with the volume low, cheerful voices floating through a place that didn't feel cheerful. An officer met us in a small interview room. He wasn't unkind. He looked like someone's dad, tired around the eyes, careful with his tone. He asked me to explain, in my own words, why I was there. So I did. I told him about my husband's death, about how I'd built my life slowly after that. I told him about David's demands, the way he used the language of care to justify control. I told him about the voicemail, about the brochure taped to my door, about the guardianship suggestion, about the bank visit. I slid the printed documents across the table one by one. No drama, no performance, just facts. The officer read silently, then looked up at me. For a moment his expression changed, a flicker of something like recognition, like he'd seen this story before with different names. "You're doing the right thing," he said. "This is a common tactic. Establishing a paper trail early helps." He asked a few questions, then typed while I answered. At the end, he gave me a card with a case number and his name written on it in block letters. It wasn't a victory, not yet. But it was a line in the sand. When I got home, my house felt different. Not softer, not warmer, but safer, as if the walls had finally learned they were allowed to protect me. David didn't call that week. I imagined him realizing the doors were closing, one by one. The bank, the lawyer, the social worker, now the police record. He couldn't bully a system the way he could bully a mother who was afraid of losing her child. And somewhere deep inside, under all the sadness and old love, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Relief, because even if David never understood why this had to happen, I did. Love without respect isn't love. It's appetite. And I was no longer on the menu. Winter settled in fully after that, the kind that presses against the windows and makes the world feel smaller. I welcomed it. There was comfort in closing the curtains early and letting the house hold me while I learned how to live inside my own decisions. David stayed quiet. Weeks passed without a call or message. At first, the silence felt like punishment. Then it softened into something closer to rest. I kept busy, not in a frantic way, but with intention. I reorganized my files, labeling folders in my careful handwriting. Medical, financial, legal. I made copies and stored them in a small fireproof box I bought after a long conversation with the clerk, who walked me through the warranty and handed me a receipt I tucked neatly into my wallet. Control, I was learning, doesn't have to be loud. One afternoon, I received a letter from my lawyer. Not alarming, informational. It confirmed that all communications from David's side had ceased since the police record was filed. No further legal inquiries, no new attempts, just quiet. I set the letter on the table and made myself soup from scratch, the kind Frank used to like. Chopping vegetables slowly, listening to the radio murmur in the background, I realized something important. I missed my son, deeply, achingly, and I still didn't regret what I'd done. Those two truths lived side by side without canceling each other out. Around that time, I began spending more hours at the library. The book club had turned into something steadier, a small circle of people who greeted one another by name. We talked about novels, yes, but also about knees that ached before rain, about children who lived far away, about the strange relief of starting over later in life. I didn't tell them everything. I didn't need to. They saw me as I was now, not as someone's mother or someone's problem, but as Margaret, a woman with opinions and stories and a voice that still mattered. One snowy morning, my neighbor Ellen knocked on my door with a plate of lemon bars and an invitation to walk with her when the weather improved. She was widowed too, I learned. Our losses were different shapes, but they fit together gently. "You seem lighter," she said once, as we sat at my table with tea between us. "I feel clearer," I replied. And it was true. The phone rang one evening just as I was turning off the lamp. David's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. "Ma," he said. His voice sounded different, quieter. Not gentle exactly, but less sharp. "I'm listening," I said. There was a pause. "I heard from the bank. They won't talk to me at all anymore." "That's correct," I replied. Another pause. He exhaled. "I didn't think it would go this far." "I did," I said softly. He didn't argue. He didn't accuse. He asked how I was doing. I told him the truth, in simple terms, that I was well, that I was busy, that I was safe. I never wanted to hurt you, he said. I know, I answered, and again, I meant it. People can harm you deeply without wanting to see themselves as cruel. We ended the call politely, not warmly, not coldly, just honestly. Afterward, I sat in the dark for a while, listening to the house breathe. I thought about the boy he had been, the man he was, and the distance between those two things. I accepted that I couldn't bridge it alone, but I could stop it from swallowing me. I slept well that night, the kind of sleep that comes when you're no longer bracing for impact. Whatever came next, I knew this much for certain. I was no longer invisible. Spring arrived slowly that year, like it was testing whether we were ready to receive it. The snow melted in uneven patches, leaving the yard muddy and honest. I opened my windows for the first time in months and let the air move through the house, carrying away the heaviness winter had trapped inside the walls. With the thaw came paperwork. I didn't expect it, but in hindsight I should have. Control, once challenged, often tries to return wearing a different coat. The letter came from a different law office than before. New letterhead, new phrasing, same intention. It requested a family financial reconciliation, suggesting mediation to resolve misunderstandings regarding shared assets. The words were smooth, cooperative on the surface, but I recognized the strategy immediately. If guardianship had failed, negotiation was the next angle. If fear didn't work, guilt might. I read the letter twice, then placed it face down on the table and went to water my plants. That was the biggest change in me, I think. The pause, the space between receiving pressure and reacting to it. When I finally called my lawyer, my voice was steady. She wasn't surprised. She explained that mediation only works when both parties acknowledge equal standing, that agreeing to it now could undo the clarity we had worked so hard to establish. We can respond, she said, but on your terms. We drafted a reply together. It stated that my finances were not shared assets, that no mediation was necessary, that any further attempts to frame them as such would be considered harassment and addressed accordingly. It was polite, it was firm, it closed the door without slamming it. When the response was sent, something unexpected happened. Nothing, no angry call, no follow-up letter, no sudden visit. Just silence. I didn't realize how much energy I'd been spending bracing myself until I felt it return to me all at once. I started doing small things that had nothing to do with survival or defense. I rearranged my living room, moving Frank's old chair closer to the window. I bought new curtains, light ones that let the sun through. I took a beginner's class at the community center, learning how to use my phone for more than calls and weather. One afternoon, I sat at the cafe on Main Street with Ellen and another woman from book club, sipping coffee and watching people pass by. We talked about nothing important and everything important. Later that week, I volunteered to help organize records at the donation center. It was quiet work, sorting forms, checking dates, making sure things were filed correctly. The supervisor thanked me and joked that I had a talent for order. I smiled to myself at that. Order had saved me. David called again near the end of April. His name on my phone no longer sent a jolt through my chest. It was just information now. "Ma," he said, careful. "I got your lawyer's letter." "Yes," I replied. "I don't understand why you're shutting me out." I took a breath. "I'm not shutting you out. I'm keeping myself intact." There was a long pause. I imagined him on the other end, wrestling with words that didn't come easily anymore. "I feel like you chose paperwork over me," he said finally. I closed my eyes. "No," I said gently. "I chose clarity. You're the one who made it necessary." He didn't respond to that. Instead, he told me about his job, about a move he was considering, about things that sounded like updates a son gives a mother when he doesn't know how to apologize but doesn't want to disappear either. I listened, I asked questions. I didn't offer money, I didn't offer solutions. I offered attention, and only as much as felt safe. When the call ended, I sat quietly for a while. I realized something then that surprised me. I no longer needed him to understand my choices. Understanding would have been nice. Validation, even nicer. But peace didn't require either one. In May, I met with my lawyer one last time to review everything. Accounts secure, documents updated, emergency contacts listed according to my wishes. Clear instructions written in my own words, signed while no one questioned my capacity. As we stood to leave, she looked at me and said, "You did this early enough to enjoy the rest of your life." That sentence stayed with me. Enjoyment came in small, unexpected forms. Morning sunlight on clean counters, shared laughter over burnt toast, the sound of my own footsteps on a walking trail, steady and unhurried. I planted tomatoes in the backyard and talked to them the way Frank used to. One evening, I sat on my porch watching the sky deepen into blue, and I thought about how close I'd come to losing more than money. I could have lost my voice, my authority, the quiet dignity of choosing my own days. People talk about revenge as something sharp and dramatic. They imagine confrontations, raised voices, someone winning and someone losing. But this didn't feel like revenge. It felt like reclaiming something that should never have been up for negotiation. I didn't punish my son. I didn't humiliate him. I didn't take anything from him. I simply stopped letting him take from me. And in that space, something new had grown. Not just independence, but confidence. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that sits comfortably in a chair near the window and knows it belongs there. As spring turned fully into summer, I realized I was no longer counting chapters of loss. I was living inside the next one. By summer, the days stretched longer than my worries. Light stayed in the rooms until nearly 9, and I found myself lingering at the table after dinner, not because I was tired, but because I was content. Contentment was new enough that I still examined it, like a stone pulled from a river, smooth and unfamiliar in my palm. David kept his distance, but not entirely. A text every few weeks, a short call now and then. We spoke about neutral things: weather, movies he'd seen, a repair he was putting off. He no longer asked questions that circled my finances or my health. Whether that was growth or strategy, I didn't try to guess. I simply noted the change and adjusted my boundaries accordingly. One afternoon, I received a call from my lawyer's office. Not an emergency, just an update. David had withdrawn his inquiry completely. No pending requests, no open actions. The file would remain archived but inactive. When I hung up, I didn't feel triumph. I felt release. That same day, I walked to the corner store for ice cream, something I rarely did in the middle of the afternoon. Children were lined up with sticky hands and loud opinions about flavors. I stood behind them, smiling at the noise, at the life spilling out of them without restraint. It occurred to me then how much of my own life I'd spent shrinking quietly, making myself easier to manage. Not just for David, but for everyone. Employers, neighbors, even friends. I had mistaken being agreeable for being safe. At home, at home, I pulled out an old notebook and began writing again. Not lists, not records, just memories. Frank's laugh, David's first steps, the way grief felt like fog that lifted and settled without warning. I wrote about fear, yes, but also about pride, about the satisfaction of knowing exactly where my money went and why, about how strength doesn't always feel strong while you're building it. One evening, Ellen invited me to a small gathering in her backyard. Nothing fancy, folding chairs, lemonade, a radio playing old songs low enough to talk over. I went, wearing a dress I hadn't worn in years, surprised by how it still fit. Not my body, but my mood. We talked until the stars came out. Someone asked what I'd been up to lately, and without thinking, I said, "I've been learning how to live my life again." The words felt right. A week later, David called unexpectedly. It was early evening, the hour when the day hasn't quite let go. "I wanted to tell you something myself," he said. "I'm moving." I listened. "Out of state," he continued. "Job opportunity, a fresh start." "I'm glad you told me," I said. "I know I messed things up," he added. The pause that followed was heavy, uncertain. "I didn't mean to scare you." "I was scared," I replied gently. "But I'm not anymore." He swallowed. I could hear it in the line. "I don't know how we got there." "We got there because we didn't stop sooner," I said. "But we stopped now." That was the closest we came to an apology. I accepted it for what it was. After the call, I sat quietly, thinking about how many endings are really beginnings wearing unfamiliar faces. David leaving didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like separation, the healthy kind, the kind that allows both people to stand upright. I spent the rest of the summer tending my garden, volunteering, walking with Ellen in the evenings when the heat broke. I hosted a small birthday dinner for myself, something I'd never done before. 6 people around my table, laughter spilling into the kitchen, dishes piled high without apology. As I washed them later, hands deep in warm water, I realized something profound in its simplicity. No one was taking anything from me. Not my time, not my money, not my sense of self. I thought back to that first night at the sink, the phone pressed to my ear, the towel shaking in my hands. I wished I could reach back through time and rest a steady palm on my own shoulder. "You will be all right," I would tell her. Better than all right. Because what I had gained wasn't just security. It was authority over my own story. And that, I understood now, was worth more than any savings account balance could ever show. The last thing David ever took from me was certainty. And even that, he couldn't hold for long. I realized it on a quiet morning in early fall, the kind where the air smells like apples and dry leaves. I was sitting at my kitchen table, sunlight cutting across the wood in a clean line, when I noticed how still my hands were. No trembling, no bracing, just hands resting where they belonged. Peace doesn't arrive all at once. It shows up in details. I paid my bills that morning and didn't double-check the balances afterward. I trusted myself. I drove to the bank later that week to close an old account I no longer needed, and the teller greeted me by name. When I left, the door shut behind me with a soft final click, and I didn't feel watched. David moved out of state in October. He sent a text when he arrived, a photo of a bare apartment, a single chair. "Made it," he wrote. "I'm glad," I replied. And I was. We spoke less after that, but when we did, there was a strange new balance between us. He no longer spoke like a man making claims. He spoke like a son learning how to stand without leaning on someone else's spine. I didn't correct him. I didn't guide him. I let him be where he was. That, too, was a boundary. In November, I finalized everything. One last meeting with my lawyer, one last review of documents. My wishes, written plainly, my authority clearly stated, my signature steady at the bottom of each page. When I handed the pen back, she smiled. "You won't need to come back unless you want to." Want to. That word lingered with me all the way home. I celebrated quietly, not with cake or champagne, but with intention. I took myself to lunch at a small diner I'd driven past for years without stopping. I ordered soup and pie. I sat by the window and watched strangers live their ordinary lives, and I felt no pull to be anywhere else. Have you ever noticed how freedom feels smaller than fear, but weighs so much less? The holidays came and went without drama. David sent a card, a simple one. No money requests. No guilt tucked between the lines. Just a "Love, David" at the bottom that felt earned, not owed. I placed it on the mantel beside Frank's photograph. Two men who had shaped my life in different ways. One through partnership, one through challenge. I learned to hold both truths without flinching. By the time spring returned again, I had fully stepped into a life that was mine. Morning walks, afternoon volunteering, evenings filled with books, phone calls, or silence that felt like choice instead of absence. I traveled once, just a short trip, staying in a modest hotel with clean sheets and a view of nothing remarkable. And yet, I slept deeply there, the kind of sleep that comes when no one is reaching for what's yours. People began to say I looked younger. I laughed at that. Age isn't something you reverse. But heaviness can be set down. One afternoon, while organizing old boxes in the attic, I found the original shoebox again. The one with receipts and notes and Frank's handwriting. I sat on the floor and went through it slowly. I didn't need it anymore, not in the same way. But I kept it, not as armor, as evidence. Evidence that I had always been capable, that I had always known how to survive, that what changed wasn't my strength, but my willingness to defend it. I thought back to the words David had said that started everything. You owe me. What a dangerous sentence that can be when spoken inside a family, when love becomes a ledger, when care becomes leverage. I don't hate my son. I never did. But I love myself enough now to say this clearly. No one is owed my obedience because of my age. No one is owed my savings because of my love. No one is owed my silence because of my fear. What I owed to myself was honesty and boundaries and the courage to choose dignity over comfort. If there's one lesson I carry forward, it's this. Legal papers matter. Records matter, calm voices matter, but what matters most is believing, truly believing, that your life still belongs to you. Even at 68, even at 70, even when someone you raised tells you otherwise. If you've stayed with me through this story, thank you for listening to an old woman find her footing again. If my story moved you, consider showing your support with a like or a subscription. It helps stories like mine reach others who might need them. And before you go, let me ask you something, honestly and gently. If you were in my place, what would you have done?